So
Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today to talk about Measure 114. I think we should probably start off by hearing a little bit about what 114 would do. And Mark, if you wouldn't mind kind of introducing yourself and the other two people who are on the call with you and explaining why you think voters should vote for Measure 114.
thank you very much and for hosting this to all the Oregonian staff writers and editors. We honor and value the press. We could not have a democracy with it. So my name is Reverend Dr. Mark Knutson, Senior Pastor, Augustana Lutheran Church, Chair of Lift Every Voice Oregon since its inception in the spring of 2018. I'm with Miles Pendleton, who's the president of the Eugene-Springfield NAACP and also chair of our equity committee, which is going to shepherd this through the legislature in a very powerful way. And also John Hummel, who's the Deschutes County District Attorney. He's one of a number of district attorneys on the state who are supporting this strongly. So we've been at this for decades, all of us, but with Lift Every Voice the last 5 years, and it's been inspiring to watch thousands of volunteers get signatures to put this on the ballot. Youngest was 11 years old, the oldest 94. It's, again, our young people are learning democracy in action. When our elected leaders fail to act in bolder ways, our young people are willing to step out and learn how it works, and they are. This is a very effective measure. It's every piece of this has been well researched. This group was started by faith leaders and people of goodwill, because when our neighbors are bleeding, we cannot sit idly by. It's a moral imperative. As my wife would say, love is a verb, it's active. And so we had that imperative to act, especially after our young people called out after Parkland, that tragedy there, and then you go on to Buffalo and Uvalde. We just had the remembrance from Roseburg of Umpqua. And so the imperative is there. But our minds and people in this movement are people of goodwill and people of faith, so all kinds of Oregonians, gun owners, veterans, non-gun owners. But our legal minds are outstanding, and they put together one of the best written ballot measures you could have in the nation. All 4 components of this: background checks, closing the Charleston loophole, training. You want to know how somebody has a gun, knows how to use it. Permit to purchase has been proven to reduce suicides and gun deaths, and 10 rounds. And we're finding rounds in Portland. My colleagues, Dr. Haynes of the Albina Ministerial Alliance and others, we've all seen them, 40 rounds being used in our cities and other places. So we have that moral imperative. And let me say this too. Today is a National Walk Your Child to School Day. And I was talking to a sister who's got a grandson who's 5, and he came home to tell about his first lockdown drill yesterday. And she said, what did you learn? She said, you have to be very, very quiet and listen to the teacher and watch her lock the doors. And he said, but my friends kept talking. Well, they're 5 years old. And we've got 3 generations, 30 years in Oregon where every child's had to learn these drills. And you know how a 5-year-old mind works. If an airplane crashes today, they think every airplane's crashing. When they have a lockdown drill, we're traumatizing our children. So this is common sense, powerful and effective and equitable. Let me say that very clearly. This is, if I read you the list of all the leaders of African-American, Latino, Asian American, Native American churches and leaders in the community, they're for it because they know this will help save lives. People are crying out right now to end the violence. This is common sense. It's well written, and Oregonians have a chance to do something to lead the nation in a day when everybody's saying enough is enough and what do we do? This is good. And we have, again, veterans, gun owners who highly support this. You'll hear from my colleagues a lot more. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Kevin, can you introduce yourself and give a brief statement about your views on this?
Certainly. My name is Kevin Sterrett. I'm the director of the Oregon Firearms Federation. And the reason we oppose this is, first of all, this measure is blatantly and provably unconstitutional and will fail eventually at great cost to Oregonians. We know that it's unconstitutional. The proponents know it's unconstitutional. It's impossible to comply with. It creates a published list of applicants, including rape and domestic violence victims, that is in the measure. It creates a whole new category of victimless crimes. The proponents of this measure are very concerned about our racist justice system, yet it creates a whole new category of crimes of people for possessing something they may have had for generations safely. Who do you think that will affect the most? There is no cap on the costs for the classes, but there's almost no way to take the classes because there's no place, there's no facilities or personnel to provide the classes. because they can only be done by police or people who've been authorized by police. They require, in spite of what John Hummel has said, it absolutely requires live fire of a gun, which requires that you have a gun in order to take the class. There are virtually no facilities to do this. There have been claims made that ranges will rent you guns, when in fact, virtually no range will rent you a gun unless you already have a gun, and ranges aren't qualified to teach this class anyway. The measure bans virtually all shotguns, which will end youth shooting competition. And the measure will have no effect whatsoever on crime, no effect on the criminal behavior of the people who are not applying for the permits we already require, because you cannot buy a gun in this state without permission of the state police, who are taking up to 2 years to provide that permission. And it will have no effect on the mass shootings that help these people raise their signatures, because the magazines that they're trying to ban have millions in circulation and are totally unregulated every place else in the country, contain no serial numbers, and are impossible to determine when you've bought them or where they came from. So a person who plans a crime, as most mass shooters do, can easily travel to another state or get one of the many millions that are already in circulation now. And on top of that, the measure is riddled with errors that the proponents themselves say are going to be ironed out by the state police or by the legislature. They even reference statutes in the measure that don't exist. And the idea that this is not going to affect minorities because they're going to have an equity committee. I asked the proponents of this measure to show me where in the measure an equity committee is required, mandated, or created. That are our objections, and I can assure you there are plenty more. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Mike, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Smith. I represent a coalition of progressive gun owners who are keenly interested in curtailing the harm done by guns on many fronts, including mass shootings. We are opposed to Measure 114 on several principles. First, let me start with where we're coming from. We believe that firearm ownership is a fundamental right, and it's guaranteed as such in both the state and federal constitutions. As a fundamental right, it should only be curtailed where there is a compelling public interest to do so. And as such, the best available research should guide what our gun policy should be. So Reverend Knutson referenced 5 parts of this. First was 4, but it sounds like 5. We break it down into 2 pieces. There's the permit to purchase piece, which is a very complicated piece, and probably could use some massaging. We acknowledge this, they acknowledge this. And then there's also the magazine ban. I want to address these 2 pieces separately. So when it comes to permit to purchase, the folks that I talk to, for the most part, agree in concept that the permit to purchase is a good idea. As always, the devil is in the details. Now they know that at least I agree that this is a good idea, because I communicated with Penny Okamoto back in February of last year about permit to purchase. She mentioned that Levo was working on an idea, and a lot of the language that's in the 114 permit to purchase seems to be borrowed from Senate Bill 604, which is a bill that Senator Frederick wrote on at my request. And that's fine. You know, people borrow language from bills all the time. They're public documents. There's nothing wrong with that, the sausage making. The problem is in the details. And some of those problems are mentioned by Kevin. Other problems include, Kevin mentioned the in-person safety training. I'd like to know where the research is to demonstrate that an in-person safety training would actually help what a permit to purchase does. Because the fact of the matter is the numbers are compelling for a permit of purchase will do, but we don't actually understand very well the action that causes permit to purchase to ameliorate gun crimes. So I think Levo and us could work together on a more equitable approach, and I would welcome that work, as well as working on other efforts to address the fundamentals, the root causes of gun crime. Now let's go to the magazine ban. Quite simply put, the idea that this is a well-researched magazine ban is a fiction. There are several objections that I could put to this. There's a theoretical objection. There's a claim that a magazine ban would lessen mass shooting casualties by forcing a shooter to reload. This is an easy obstacle to overcome. You just train or carry other firearms. There's practical objection. Lawyers for Measure 114 acknowledged in their both in their they acknowledged in their discussion in front of the Secretary of State that they don't understand guns, they're afraid of guns. And this lack of understanding has led to many practical flaws. Kevin already mentioned the shotgun issue, which is to say it permits tube-fed magazines that hold more than 10 rounds for a lever action gun. For some reason, the lawyers behind 114 thought that pump action and lever action are the same thing. They're not. They're very different. Language like this matters when you're crafting gun policy. There's evidential reasons. When we look at the best studies out there, they show that the evidence that a magazine ban would have any positive effect is inconclusive at best. And then there's equity issues, which again, the proponents for Measure 114 acknowledge. They acknowledge this in a town hall presented before Democrats in Washington County, where they mentioned, first of all, there were equity issues that they were going to address, and where Miles, in fact, admitted that this could be used to target persons of color, this magazine ban, which is something that we have discovered in our own research, that magazine bans are often unfairly, disproportionately enforced on communities of color. And so we don't think that 114 is the right way to go. We agree that there are some pieces of it that could work, but overall, the entire package is badly flawed, and we would ask that the voters not pass this.
Thank you. Miles or John, I'm wondering if there's any aspects of what the opponent said that you would want to hone in on. Specifically, I guess I'm interested in the aspect of a publishable list of names of permit holders, concerns about lack of safety training, the equity issue, or any of the other issues that they've raised.
Certainly, I'll let John go first and then I'll follow up after him.
Sure. So many things, right? And I think we'll probably have more focused questions down the road, but I'll just pick a few. And I want to start with this. Are you for the status quo or are you for 114, right? I think we have to get down to that. Anyone who opposes something, I think a lot of times we like to say, hey, I'm not accepting what's going on now. I just don't like that. There might be a better way. Voters are going to have two choices. You're going to vote yes on the status quo, or you're going to vote yes on 114. Because if you don't have 114, you have the status quo. The status quo is unacceptable to me. It is unacceptable to me, the number of Oregonians who are dying from gun deaths. 114 will make an improvement in that regard. My friends say there could be a measure that would be even better. Well, great. Okay, when 114 passes, I look forward to them introducing a bill that's going to be even better than 114. But so let's just say that the status quo is unacceptable. 114 is good. Now, so first, let's talk about the capacity, the high capacity magazine limits. The data shows us that they reduce deaths in mass shootings. Now, mass shootings aren't the number one cause of death number one cause of gun deaths, admittedly. But when somebody goes out to slaughter people in a mass shooting at a grocery store, at a football stadium, and they're using a high capacity magazine, 62% more deaths occur at shootings when high capacity magazines are used. Now let's talk about the permit to purchase. Johns Hopkins did a study. They estimated the Connecticut permit to purchase law, which is similar to Oregon's. It lowered the gun homicide rate by 28% and the gun suicide rate by 33%. Also, we have a study that after the repeal of Missouri's permit to purchase law, gun homicides increased by 47% and gun suicide rates increased by 23%. So these laws are effective. They save lives. The status quo is unacceptable. That's why I support Measure 114. And I think Miles wants to talk about some equity issues.
Most certainly. I really appreciate you honing in on this idea of the status quo and how the status quo is simply unacceptable. When we talk about this conversation of equity, what we always have to remember is that equity is action. And equity doesn't wait for a moment where it feels comfortable. Equity doesn't wait for a moment where things might feel convenient. Equity takes advantage of the opportunity that comes before it. What I continue to hear running through my mind is that Dr. King remark that he mentioned during the March on Washington, where he said the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. It's always very enticing to wait for the perfect alternative, to wait for the perfect moment, the so-called perfect alternative or moment. But the truth of the matter is that moment never arrives. We have to take advantage of the opportunities that are before us, just as Measure 114 is right now. And so when we talk about this conversation of equity and gun violence and how it has damaged and traumatized our state, what we see across the state is while every single community, every single sector, every single corner of Oregon has been impacted very direly by this issue of gun violence, certainly the groups that have been most disproportionately impacted and traumatized have been Black, BIPOC, and otherwise marginalized groups and communities. And so this idea that we can just wait for another opportunity when we have seen evidence that, other opportunities, other measures have not passed. They haven't even got their vote on the Oregon State Legislature. So on the floor of the Oregon State Legislature, I should say. I think it's well-intentioned, but it just isn't grounded in the realities that we've seen statewide and politically, the avenues that exist to get legislation such as this passed through. And so, I really do encourage people to continue to understand also that a strong conversation is this idea of self-determination, self-informed responses to historic inequities and prejudices. And that is exactly what this measure is. As Reverend Knutson mentioned, this is one of the broadest and most diverse coalitions you will ever find that I have ever seen, having grown up here in Eugene and in Oregon and watched politics and followed politics for a long time. Very rarely, if ever, have I seen as diverse of a broad of a coalition working on this initiative over 4 years throughout an iterative process that went time and time again back and forth between communities of color, communities that are most disproportionately impacted by this. And so this idea of, this idea of self-determination is clear in this present moment, because this is a measure that has been brought forward through conversations and being informed by Black communities, by Latinx communities, by communities across all different religious spectrums and faiths. And as we continue to track the data right now, and we continue to see the polling, the last poll that we saw, as it was broken down by racial demographics, had Black and BIPOC communities the strongest demographic in support of this measure. So, we have these conversations and we say that certain groups don't support it or certain groups aren't in favor of it, when in reality, we're really speaking on behalf of these communities as opposed to articulating what their stance is. And so I really would encourage us to caution ourselves and to actually engage in conversations with these community members, with these leaders, with these organizations, because we are having these conversations and they're fruitful. Are there concerns? Yes. Are they valid concerns? Yes, just as any concern is with any measure that we bring forward as it relates to bigotry, prejudice, and bias. That is always going to be a concern within any measure that we bring forward, regardless of what it is. That is just the reality of implicit bias. And so as we have these conversations, the one thing that we can do to correct them is do what we're doing now. Bring together a diverse coalition of people to have conversation, to provide input, to give that self-determined, self-informed option to move forward. And that is exactly what we're doing with this measure too. And I would push back also on what Mr. Smith said. I remember that town hall with Washington County quite well. I think you've misquoted me, paraphrased, or you just misperceived what I said, because I never said it would. At best, I said it could. But again, just as I've said now, any measure could be used in a bigoted way. It's about what conversations do we have proactively to ensure that that does not transpire. That is the crux of policy these days.
Great, thank you. Kevin, let me ask you a question. Is there any permitting or licensing system that you would support?
First, I've got to say a couple of things here. First of all, you're talking about diverse communities. Neither the Multnomah County nor the Oregon Democratic Party will endorse this measure. And when we're mentioning Dr. King, I think it's important to remember.
So actually, can we go back? I really would like to.
Was refused a pistol permit by the police. This is the truth that the proponents of this measure don't want to talk about when they're quoting Dr. King. And the fact is that these measures have been used against communities of color, will continue to be used. And the same people who propose this measure, who do not trust the police, now want to turn over infinite control of a fundamental right to the very police they don't trust. So
that
all
is
the-
a question I'd like to get into later, but I would like to ask you, is there any kind of permitting or licensing system that you would support?
I believe that, as the courts have found, the Second Amendment is a fundamental right. If we have a permitting system, then we have to apply that to your right to ask me questions as a journalist, my right to go to the church of my choice, or write a letter to the editor. If I have to ask for permission, that ability to give it can be abused, will be abused, and should be applied to other fundamental rights. The fact is, we have a permitting system now, and it is being abused. It's being abused every day by the state police. I see no reason to believe why that would change. So no, I believe that what we need to do, which this measure will not address, is hold people accountable for their behavior, which we do not do because we don't believe in incarceration. We don't believe in arresting people. We don't believe in prosecuting people. When a Black child is gunned down in the streets of Portland from a stray bullet, we don't want the shooters to go to jail. We don't want to do that at all. That's how we end this problem, not by taking the rights or demanding that we ask for permission from an agency that should not be a judicial body in the first place. The police's job is to enforce the law, not to create it or interpret it. So no, a permitting system is fundamentally racist, unconstitutional, wrong, and unworkable.
And is there any aspect of, I apologize, I had a follow-up and I just lost it. Let me go to actually the question, the issue you raised regarding police agencies having this determination, this power to determine who is eligible, who may receive a permit. And Mark, Miles, or John, if any of you want to jump in on this.
I can jump in on this. We do it now, right? This is not novel. Right now, in every community in Oregon, all 36 counties, if somebody wants to obtain a concealed carry permit, in Oregon statute, they have to go to their local sheriff. They have to meet certain criteria. They have to complete a background check, and that sheriff has to decide whether to grant that concealed carry permit. If the sheriff decides not to grant that permit, the person who's denied a permit can go to the circuit court in their county. So that's what we're going to do here, but just adding that if you want to purchase a gun, rather than just carry a gun concealed, if you want to purchase a gun, you also have to go through that process. And it has the added component of you have to demonstrate that you know how to use a gun. That makes sense to me. If you want to drive a car in Oregon, which is a deadly weapon, you have to demonstrate that you can drive a car. And so we've added the condition that you have to demonstrate that you can safely use a firearm. And also we've added one other component. The officer gets to assess whether they believe you're a danger to yourself or others. Right now, that is a glaring omission in Oregon law. Somebody who goes to Walmart to buy a gun, they can buy a gun as long as they don't have a disqualifying conviction, a felony or a domestic violence conviction. The Walmart clerk is not able to ask him or herself, does this person seem mentally unstable to me? Do I think they're going to go out and kill someone if I give them that gun? They're not allowed to deny the sale because of that. So not a new system. We right now have a system where people have to go to their local law enforcement to obtain a concealed carry permit. This is saying you have to go to local law enforcement to purchase a gun, and the local law enforcement officer is able to assess whether you can use a gun safely and whether you're a danger to self or others.
And that's totally false. What he said is not true. Any gun dealer can deny a purchase anytime they want and do frequently. So John, that's not true. You better check the law.
Let me ask you, Mike. You noted that there are things that the devil's in the details. So why are none of these fixable by the legislature? I mean, is there an argument that let's pass this, let's have the legislature attend to some of the issues that may arise that we don't either know yet or that are imperfect in the measure itself?
So first of all, most immediately to your question, I think parts of this are fixable in the legislature. I think parts of this are fundamentally flawed and shouldn't have been part of the measure in the first place. When we talk about the stuff that can be fixed, we agree that the permit to purchase can and should be fixed. I disagree with Mr. Hummel that this is a binary choice between we take action or we have status quo. We agree status quo doesn't work. Our proposal is that this thing fails, we come back and we come back with better proposals that will be more equitable and that will address the root causes also. But the permit to purchase part is one thing. The magazine ban is something completely separate. Despite claims made to the contrary, when we look at the best available research, and I can quote here our study by the Rand Corporation. This is a study on gun violence led by Dr. Andrew Morale, who is a behavioral scientist at Rand. The study is funded by Arnold Ventures, which is a charitable group, and their gun violence efforts are part of the Biden administration's Community Violence Intervention Collaborative. This study that Dr. Morale is doing is a review of literature. So to give you an idea what that is, it's a review where they weed out studies that are weak and flawed. And frankly, there's a lot of weak, flawed research out there on gun policy. And they weed that out. They show what the strong studies show. This is the kind of study that is considered near the highest standard for evidence-based research. When they look at magazine bans and assault weapons bans, the evidence that it has an impact on gun violence and gun crime is inconclusive. So we really don't have strong research either way for what a magazine ban would do. The best evidence that we have is that it will cause a temporary spike in demand for magazines as people try to purchase magazines either to get grandfathered in or to become compliant. However, we can look at how other states enforce this and see that the enforcement is not neutral. It unfairly impacts communities of color in Massachusetts and in other states. And this is why when we say that there are equity issues, we try to listen to folks who are in communities besides the one that I come from, right? I mean, I'm a male presenting white person. My group is not, I'm the only male presenting white person in my group, by the way. And also when we look at the polling, I mean, we can cite some polls that say that support for this measure is strong in communities of color. We can point to other polls that show that it's weakest, it's weak in communities of color and strongest among white, older, college-educated voters. And I think the polling firm was Emerson that released that poll. So yes, to answer your question briefly, there are parts that can be fixed. There are parts that we can revisit whether this passes or fails. And I look forward to revisiting those. But the magazine ban, it's too much. We should reject this on the magazine ban alone because it's bad policy.
And I would like to understand that a little bit more. Like why is the over 10 rounds a problem? I guess what are the either the safety or the practicality, or what are the considerations there that make that a problematic provision?
So I've already pointed to the evidential problem, which is that the evidence that a magazine ban would have a positive effect on gun violence or gun social issues is inconclusive at best. So let's take a look at the practical problems. First of all, most handguns are sold with magazines, out of the box, are sold with magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Those magazines become illegal if we enact this ban. It then becomes, the onus is then on the gun owner to do one of two things: either toss out their magazines that they bought before a ban was even being considered, or hand those over to the police and buy new magazines with under 10 rounds, or they have to prove somehow that they bought those magazines before the ban came into effect. Now, if you're like me, you bought magazines before this ban was even being considered, like 10 years ago, and you didn't necessarily keep the receipt.
So I'm not so much interested.
Affirmative defense.
So I guess I'm more interested in just, in using a firearm. What is the impact of not being able to use a magazine with more than 10 rounds?
And Helen, if I come in a minute after this too,
Yeah. So the impact is, one, you have to replace your magazines or somehow prove that you own them. That's one thing. From a defense point of view, if we're talking about 10 rounds of ammunition in a pistol, that's not necessarily going to make a difference in a firefight if you're talking about defending yourself. The problem comes in when we look at other parts, like the shotgun ammunition problem. Now, again, this was a ballot measure that was written by people who didn't understand the difference between lever action and pump action. So we have shotguns now that can accept more than 10 rounds of ammunition. They're not designed to hold 10 rounds of standard length ammunition, but they will hold 10 rounds of what's called short shell ammunition or more. And so in order to legally own that shotgun, you now either have to permanently modify it, or you have to turn it over to the police and purchase a shotgun that will hold less than 10 rounds or 10 rounds or fewer of short shell ammunition. So that's just some of the problems that come in.
Right, and maybe Kevin, actually, if you can weigh in, and then Mark, you can jump in after. But I guess I'm trying to understand what are the restrictions that in using a weapon, what does having a smaller magazine hamper? Is it a convenience issue? Is it a safety issue?
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. It's a safety issue. You know, our police, most of our police carrying firearms, a standard magazine is 17 rounds. If these things are somehow inherently evil and dangerous, we should certainly take them away from the police. But the question shouldn't be, why should a person be allowed to have more than 10 rounds? The question should be to the proponents of this measure, what experience do you have? What do you know that demonstrates to you that in a conflict, and we're not talking hunting issues here, this isn't hunting regulations. If a person's life is in danger, if a single mom who's protecting her children is attacked by multiple assailants, where did they come up with the brilliant insights to decide exactly how many rounds she should be allowed to have? And if she is allowed to have more than one 10-round magazine, then she's allowed to have more than 10 rounds. So what is the logic behind this, except to create an environment that puts more law-abiding people in jeopardy and creates a situation where, as Michael said, keeping a receipt, it won't even matter if you keep a receipt. There's nothing to prove when you bought a magazine. And under this law, if I own a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds, and I don't even leave the house with it, I can still be charged with the possession of it if I can't prove when I bought it. And because an affirmative defense basically means you have to plead guilty to something, since the magazine has no marks on it to prove anything, I can be charged with having that crime of having that magazine over and over and over again.
Okay,
So,
and Mark.
Yes. Let me just say, I know you're journalists and you're going to be doing your fact checking. I'm hearing a lot of misinformation being put out there right now. And it's like a checklist. We can't address it all. We couldn't even begin to address it. I'll go with Johns Hopkins and their study. They're nationally acclaimed, and their information says, yes, this does. Harvard, Purdue. I'll start going down the list of places that are doing excellent research on this. So that's not a question. Does it make a difference? And also the equity piece. I am just astounded to hear. You know, I visited the Oregon Federation site a few years ago when my rabbi colleague was being run through it, and Japanese Americans, and it was the most racist, anti-Semitic.
You know what? Let's stay focused on this measure.
No, but I'm saying know the source of where you're hearing these things from.
Yeah, why don't we stay focused?
But you know what?
I think stay focused, Mark, because now you're simply lying.
Well, and you know what? Let's kind of bring the temperature down here, and let's just talk about this measure and the legality or the provisions, et cetera.
But in terms of equity, again, I can name 100 leaders in Oregon in the BIPOC community who've been working on this. They're crying out saying, we got to do this. Their churches, their communities are. So that's, you know, we put in an equity committee, not because the bill is inequitable. It's already got a safety piece built into it. But we wanted to be proactive. I don't think any measure in the state has had an equity committee in place like we do. And when who's on it is amazing. So we're just being proactive to make sure the implementation is really excellent. And it's modeled after the concealed weapons permit law. And if you read your Oregonian article, 4 pages I read a few months ago, I didn't see a single issue of equity listed in that, and for people getting permits to purchase or get a concealed weapon. So we're getting some arguments put out there that really don't wash. And again, look where this is coming from. This is coming from veterans who only get 20-round clips to defend our country. It's coming from hunters who only use 5 bullets to hunt. And yet a child could be subject to 50. You know, it's Sandy Hook, when the shooter had to reload, 11 children escaped. 11. What's a child's life worth? what are safe communities and safe schools worth? We cannot wait. If we keep saying, listen, do something new, we took 2 bills to the 2019 legislature, did not get a hearing. We had sponsors, but no hearing. So to stand up as citizens and say enough is enough, but we can take real action. It's fair to gun owners. I'm sorry, nobody's getting their guns taken away. They can still go purchase. But the Charleston loophole, Clemente Pickney, Reverend Dr. State Senator Clemente Pickney was in the doctoral program right before me. And the night I started, he got the first ever posthumous doctorate from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. His family was weeping. 9 people in a church gunned down. The Charleston loophole being closed will end that sale of a gun to someone who's not past the background check. This is common sense. This is stuff we have to do. You know, you can say it's a terrible thing, but to be complicit and quiet when something is terrible, you're complicit with it. And as a society, as a state, if we stand back and say, okay, let's wait a little longer. No, how many more lives are going to be lost? How many more children traumatized through lockdown drills and the fear of gun violence? I chaired the Northwest Health Foundation board, and Senator Mark Hatfield was the first chair 10 years before me. It's the most diverse board of a foundation in the Northwest you will find. And we talked about health being physical, it is mental and emotional, it is spiritual, and it is social. And I'll tell you, every child at Uvalde who experienced that mass shooting, that community was shattered. Every child, whether it had physical damage or not, they all had mental and emotional damage for years to come. Every one of them had a spiritual damage. How can a person kill another person with a gun? And the social fabric was ripped apart in that community. So this is I'm passionate about this because we cannot sit back and wait. It's a Kairos moment. We say, well, next week we'll endorse these measures. Next week we talk chronologically, but theologically, as a clergy and as imams and rabbis and all the others involved in this, we know there are Kairos moments where the opportunity comes to take an action that was not there 10 years, 20 years ago, or may not be there in the future. And we're in that moment in Oregon. And if Oregon does this, it's going to give hope to the nation. Believe me, this will be bellwether for the country. They'll say every day, ordinary people did an extraordinary thing. They took on the violence related to guns, and it's a pandemic. So it's a spiritual crisis. It's a public health crisis. I cannot underscore that enough.
And Kevin, let me ask you, do you think that there is a gun violence problem that the government needs to do something about?
Absolutely. I've said this over and over again. You look at, Oregon's biggest city, Portland, where you have a district attorney, you have people in power who refuse to address or prosecute people who are committing horrible, violent crimes. This is clearly when we've told the police, we don't respect you, we don't want you out there. We've eliminated units that attack gun violence. Gun violence has spiked. Obviously, something has to be done, but clearly the policies of the people in charge of Oregon as a state, Portland as a city, are a colossal failure. If we set the message out there to people that we will not prosecute you for committing a crime, and I can point to a great example of John Hummel refusing to prosecute people who committed crimes, what do you think you're going to get?
So it's mostly on the enforcement end. Is there anything on the preventative side that you think the state should be doing?
Well, that is preventative. If the state makes it clear to people that they're going to be held accountable and stops criticizing, attacking, and demeaning the police and allow them to do their jobs while holding them accountable for their behavior too, yeah, that is exactly preventative. We have people waiting hours to get a police response for dangerous situations. That's a failure of the government, a failure of their policies, and an enormous indictment of what we're doing now. Of course, I believe that.
So it's primarily, but it's enforcement. You're not looking at, for instance, the red flag law or anything along those lines to limit suicides or anything.
Well, look, if you look at the makeup of the red flag law, an unqualified person can make an accusation that means another person's property is taken away before they've not even been accused of a crime, let alone convicted of a crime. And in this state, you can have a red flag law used against you for the crime of having legally purchased a firearm or having used marijuana recently. And if you get a professional assessment from a mental health professional that says you're perfectly normal, you're not allowed to use that in your defense. These laws are horribly written, completely misguided, and have really accomplished nothing but attack people who've done nothing wrong. There's no due process in this law unless you hire an attorney and try it at your own expense, try to prove to a judge that you're not crazy. How is that fair, equitable, or provide due process?
And let me ask, do you agree with closing the Charleston loophole in background checks?
No, it's not a loophole. It's a safeguard that protects people when the state police do not do their job, which they are not doing. If you try to get a background, I hear from people every single day who are waiting months, sometimes years for their background checks to be completed, sometimes weeks for their background checks to just be initiated. Everything to these people is a loophole. And in fact, it's a safeguard. If you are a single mom with a stalker desperately trying to find a way to protect yourself, and the police say, come back in 6 months or a year, that's not a loophole, that's a death sentence.
Thank you. Miles.
Yeah, if I may, I must say, as I'm listening to Kevin speak, I'm seeing an incongruency here, because on one hand, when we're talking about the measure and they're bringing up the inequity issue, they say that law enforcement, how could you charge law enforcement with being the permitting agent? Yet all the while, then when we ask them what their solution is, they just say, well, incarcerate people. Well, that's entrusting law enforcement in a way that over the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 250 years, we've seen a clear status quo representation of inequity in the way that they prosecute people and charge people. So it's not an equity issue. I just want to make that very clear. In one situation, they're saying the issue with this measure is an inequity issue, but then on the other side, what they're promoting is an even greater inequity issue because it's the status quo. As was said in our last conversation, there has never been a shortage of individuals willing to prosecute people, especially BIPOC community members, Black community members, so on and so forth. And so as we have these conversations, we need to be really intentional and really authentic in what we're putting forward here. And you can't say inequity in this hand, the law enforcement can't be trusted in this hand, but yet all the while, in the other hand, well, they should just incarcerate everybody. It's incongruent. And so I would just
Really, I
really
didn't
wanted
say
us
they
to
should
make sure that we've
incarcerate
identified
everybody.
that.
And the police don't prosecute people. The police's job is to enforce the law, not interpret the law. No one said they should incarcerate everyone. What they should be doing is capturing and arresting people who are murdering the people in your community. And if you think that the answer to that is incarcerating anybody, then I think you should take that up with the victims of the minority communities in Portland who are suffering under the very policies you are promoting.
And so
Kevin, I've done funerals. I've done a number of funerals.
You know what?
And I just want to be real. What's happening in the community? Go, Miles, back to you, please. But
yeah, I just want to say, and you can ask any BIPOC community member, any Black community member, there has never been a shortage of prosecutors. There has never been a shortage of law enforcement people willing to investigate. And as you said, prosecutors on the alternative end of that process, willing to prosecute individuals for committing violent acts. That's what mass incarceration is. We've seen the highest rates of incarceration out of any nation in the entire world. And at any point in history, more incarcerated folks. We have more incarcerated individuals, or at least did several years ago, than we had slaves at one point. I mean, it's clear. So, let's just be authentic about that as well, sir.
And I'd like to move on. Mike, let me ask you this question. You talked about, if this fails, or regardless, if there's an opportunity to do work in the legislature. This has, or elements of this measure have been introduced into the legislature before, but have gone nowhere. Don't you think that it is, it's clear that the legislature hasn't been interested in any of these elements? So why not kind of force their hand?
I think there are other ways to force their hand besides a ballot measure. In particular, we are working with legislators right now on measures that we can pass to ameliorate the root causes of gun violence, as well as possibly put forth a more equitable permit to purchase solution. Like I say, there are other ways to influence the legislature. The mere existence of this ballot measure can influence the legislature. And what I've heard from legislators is a mixed bag, quite frankly. I've heard some legislators say that this sucks the oxygen out of the room for some of the measures that we're trying to put forward. I've heard other legislators say that this gives new impetus if whether this passes or fails. So if it can fail closely, we wouldn't want it to fail massively in order to have a permit to purchase. But even then, there are other things that we can do to address, for example, suicidality, which, as it turns out, is one of the root causes for mass shootings in most cases. There are things that we can do to address what we call manifestos. So this is where you have somebody who's a mass shooter who starts posting stuff online to indicate that they might be dangerous. There are ways that you could report these folks, that the police can check in and say, hey, are you okay? Do you need to maybe sit down or something? There are other measures that we can take to try to address those root causes, like I say. So again, this isn't a situation where we either take the packages that are being offered or we accept an unacceptable status quo. And I think they even acknowledge that, because they even acknowledge that there are things that we need to do to massage this once this passes the legislature. So they're not even offering this as a package deal. They're offering, they hope, of an improvement on what's being offered right now as part of their deal. Does that answer your question, Helen?
It did, thank you.
Okay.
And let me also ask you, do you believe that there should be training involved in order to own a firearm?
I think there should be education involved in order to own a firearm. Where that education is offered doesn't really matter to me. The permit to purchase that I originally proposed in 604 said that you have to have a safety training requirement, which could be equivalent to what's offered in a hunter's education course you can take for $10, just as an example. Or we could offer some of this training even in the school curriculum. And I'm not talking about how to shoot, but I'm talking about, if you see a gun, what do? You don't touch it. You assume it's loaded. You especially don't touch the trigger. You don't point it at anything that you're not willing to destroy. Okay. Now, what I've just cited here is 3 of the 4 what are called fundamental laws of gun safety. The 4th one being, be aware of your target and what's beyond it. This is stuff that we could teach in the schools to give everybody a base foundation for what they need to know to be around a firearm, not to own a firearm, just to be around it. Things like this, I think, would make a difference. In addition to things like, if you have a concealed handgun license, how do you de-escalate a situation? Because you do run into people who want to cause harm a lot. And I think if a concealed handgun owner has a solution besides just pulling their gun, such as de-escalating the situation, that could help to make everybody safer. I think that education on safe storage is going to be important. I think education on recognizing when you're in a mental crisis is going to be important, because people with firearms in a mental crisis need to have the self-awareness that they need to get distance and time between themselves and that firearm in order to prevent a negative outcome. By the way, this is parenthetical. Part of the reason why we're opposed to 114 is because we see that it could put up barriers to getting that time and distance between a person and their firearm. So yes, I think education training is essential for proper firearms ownership, for safe firearms ownership. I think there are better ways to do it than are presented in 114. And in particular, in-person safety training, I don't think is necessary. I don't think it's workable. I think back when we didn't have working vaccines, it was actively dangerous. And that's part of the reason why we oppose that in particular as a part of a permit to purchase.
Thank you. Do any of the other edit board members or Max, do you have any questions that you want to pose? No? Okay.
I'm good. Thank you for the good discussion.
Great. Thank you. I think we have time for just like a minute close by each group, and Mark, from your group, you guys can decide who gives that. But Kevin, if you want to start off, and then Mike, and then we'll go to the proponents at the end.
Thank
We
you.
have 2
I would
hours
just
closed
add
because
that-
time-wise, I think the time has been heavily for the opposition.
You know, this is not a debate, Mark. This is
I know
about
it isn't.
us
I know.
getting answers to our questions. So I think let's just move on with a close
So
statement,
I think
please.
I'd like to have John and
Thank you, Helen. I would like to just close by saying that we saw what happened when people were misled in ballot measure 110, and well-meaning people voted for a measure that now has people dying all over our streets. All I ask is that people not listen to my arguments or the proponents' arguments. Read the ballot measure. Our stop114.com website explains what is in this measure. I think if people actually see what's in this measure, not what's being promoted by the people who are presenting misinformation about it, that the measure will fail. All we ask is that people actually pay attention and read the measure. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. And Mike?
I'd like to thank you, Helen, and I'd like to thank the members of the Oregonian board for hearing me out on behalf of the other members of my coalition. We know you probably took a chance on us, and I hope that you were rewarded by taking that chance. We feel that 114 is a deeply flawed measure, and that the voters should not support it because it is deeply flawed. We don't have any fundamental problems with permit to purchase. In particular, have been a proponent of permit to purchase, as I'm sure folks are aware. What we see are issues with how permit to purchase here is being proposed. We have fundamental problems with the magazine ban because of how we feel it will be enforced, and because we feel that there will be no positive outcome from such a magazine ban. The research being presented by the proponents aside, we believe that our research is stronger research. As for the equity issues that we saw, we agree, and I just want to address this quickly. I agree with Miles that the enforcement of the gun crime unit in the Portland Police was massively biased, that it impacted communities of color most harshly. And I'm very glad that we did away with that unit. Now, I know that there are calls in the city of Portland to reestablish that unit. I personally disagree with that because of the impact it would have on community of color. But I also want to point out that right now, the way 114 is written, I feel that enforcement of 114 would unfairly impact communities of color, and we have some evidence for that. There are better ways to do the permit to purchase in order to lessen, not completely eliminate. I mean, I don't think you can completely eliminate racial bias in our society, but you can do a lot to address it and to ameliorate it. And I think we can do better there. There are leaders in communities of color that have also approached us about opposing 114 for reasons. And I think, Miles, you know some of those folks. So this isn't, for lack of a better way of putting it, a false dichotomy. This isn't a dichotomy. This isn't a matter of we have to accept the status quo, which is unacceptable, or we have to accept 114, which is also, in my opinion, equally unacceptable. There are all sorts of other things we can do. And I hope that I can work with Levo on better solutions to the problems that we face in the future. But for right now, we find ourselves on opposite sides of this measure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And Mark or whoever?
Helen, I just want to say thank you to the editorial board and to your leadership. I'll defer to Miles and John to close. I've had my share.
Thank you, everyone. You know, this is interesting. You have the group in favor of 114 that we're real proud of it, and we can tell you that and support every position in it. And then we have one of the opponents who's opposed to every lick of it. And then you have one of the opponents who's, you know, kind of supportive of one part of it and not supportive of the other part of it, right? And what does that tell you? That the opponents are split on it. That's interesting, right? And I respect Michael. Michael says he supports, you know, some aspects of it, and he would like it to be even better. Like, let's spend some time working on it, and we can get the perfect ballot measure. Well, you know, I think this is a good ballot measure, but you know, let's take him at his word that if it can be improved, let's wait and do it down the road. How many kids are we willing to sacrifice when we wait for the perfect? Guns are the second leading cause of death among children and teenagers in Oregon. How many kids should we allow to die while we wait for the perfect ballot measure? I'm not willing to wait. One, I think this is a perfect ballot measure. But two, if you think it's good, but you think there's a great one out there, and you want to wait to get there, you're saying that it's okay that kids die when we wait for the perfect. If you think this is good, but it's not perfect, support it, come back with another measure, and heck, if it's better, well, let's all support that too, okay? But let's also remember, this is not novel. 15 states have permit to purchase laws. 10 states have magazine capacity laws. Hunters in Oregon are already limited in their magazine capacity. Capacity limits are 2 to 5 for hunters. And the United States Supreme Court, even though they have absolutely, you know, chipped away at gun safety regulations, even in Bruin, they have said that there are gun safety regulations that are permitted under the Second Amendment. Now we're going to battle about which those are, and that's fine. But it's not that the Supreme Court has said you cannot enact any gun safety regulation. So we've seen it in many other states. Kids are dying on the street. This is a good measure, at least. I think it's a perfect measure, but if you think it's good and it's not perfect, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's save kids' lives now. And if you want to come back next session and make it even better, we'll be there with you.
Great, thank you. And Miles, if you want to say something briefly, that would be fine.
Certainly. Well, thank you. And once again, I just want to echo everybody's thank yous to you, Helen. Thank you to the whole editorial board. It's been a great joy being on call with y'all today. My one take home message is just, we don't transform society's institutions by insulating or isolating one demographic group or a couple demographic groups from interacting with any specific institution. And what I'm referring to in this case specifically is law enforcement. We don't change law enforcement. We don't go and transform law enforcement into an anti-racist institution by saying, well, we just don't want Black folk interacting with them at all. We don't want BIPOC folk interacting with all. We don't want marginalized groups interacting with them at all. We have to come up with different solutions so that those interactions are mitigated and they don't happen. No, what we do is, just as Dr. King said, is you commit to doing what was written down on paper and promised from the inception of this nation. And that is exactly what this measure does. When we talk about an equity apparatus and institutional equity, what it is continuing to charge society's institutions with what they've promised to do, implementing an oversight agency and apparatus that closely watches by authentically and intentionally and actively when people or individuals or organizations or institutions veer off course, you're right there to correct them, just as this measure attempts to install. And so that is how we transform society's institutions. Anything else that tries to create a situation where Black individuals don't need to interact with law enforcement in one capacity, or Latinx individuals don't need to interact with law enforcement in a capacity that white individuals might otherwise do, then that in itself is inherently equitable and starts to veer us toward a separate but equal mindset. And that's just not what we need to do. So this is what true equity looks like. It's moving institutions forward and providing oversight to ensure that when they veer off course, we can correct them right then and there in that moment. And it's that corrective action, which has never taken place previously throughout the context of history, or at least not enough, not to an extent, strong enough, large enough where we can actually achieve equity. But again, that's what this measure seeks to correct.
Great. Thank you all for your time. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it. We may follow up with additional questions. The various pieces of research that you all have referred to, et cetera. But thank you again. This was really helpful.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.